A close call. Back in November of 2017, I was working at a Chick-fil-A in my small hometown in New Mexico. With only about 5,000 residents, it was a quiet place. Nothing you'd expect to inspire the kind of story I'm about to tell you. That night, I was called in to cover the night shift for a new employee who hadn't shown up. It was the third shift in a row I'd been asked to cover, but I didn't mind too much. Money's money, right? Plus, a couple of my close friends, Lucy and Sam, were working that night too, so I figured the shift would go by quickly. Aside from Lucy and Sam, there were 3 newer employees on the schedule: Alex, Luke, and Eric. I didn't know them very well yet. Alex, the manager for the night, and Luke both left around 11 p.m., leaving me, Lucy, Sam, and Eric to finish the shift. At first, the night was slow, unusually so. But just before we were about to wind things down, there was a sudden rush of customers. In the span of 10 minutes, we served about 20 people. It was chaotic, and during the rush, Eric burned his hand on the grill. Lucy took him to the hospital, leaving Sam and me to close up the restaurant. The rest of the shift was uneventful, apart from staying late to clean up. After we finished, Sam headed out, and I stayed behind to lock up. I'd been working there for 2 years, so Sam trusted me to handle it. As I walked toward my car in the empty parking lot, I felt a sharp blow to the back of my head. Everything went black. When I woke up, I was sitting in a lounge chair, unable to move. It felt like sleep paralysis. I couldn't lift my arms, legs, or even my head. Panic set in as I realized I couldn't even yell for help. My attempts at screaming came out as nothing but muffled, unintelligible sounds. Then I heard a voice. "Good, you're awake." My eyes darted around, desperate to see who had spoken. I couldn't turn my head, but eventually, someone stepped into view. It was Eric. He stood there, looming over me, wearing a surgical mask and holding a scalpel. His eyes were cold, calculating. "I've been wanting to do this for months," he said. Before I could process what was happening, he began slicing into my arm. The pain was excruciating, but I couldn't move or fight back. Whatever he'd done to me had completely immobilized my body. All I could do was let out pitiful, strangled whimpers. Just as I was beginning to lose hope, I heard the sound of sirens. Red and blue lights flashed through the room. Eric stood up, startled, scalpel still in hand. Moments later, the police burst through the door. Eric refused to drop the knife. The officers shouted at him to comply, but he didn't listen. In the end, they shot him. Paramedics arrived shortly after and stopped the bleeding from my arm. They discovered Eric had drugged me to keep me from running, and possibly to ensure I remained conscious as he continued his sickening act. I later found out that Lucy and Sam had returned to the restaurant after noticing my car still in the parking lot. Concerned, they reviewed the security footage and saw Eric attack me. They called the police, likely saving my life. The most chilling part? Eric wasn't new to this. The person whose shift I had been covering? He was Eric's first victim. That's why he hadn't shown up. Eric had killed him. I don't know how I managed to survive that night, but I'll always be grateful to Lucy and Sam for following their instincts. Without them, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. The stranger at my window. 5 years ago, I lived in a small rural town in an apartment building that felt out of place. Sitting alone about 3 miles from town down a country road with few neighbors. It was usually quiet, save for the occasional drunk neighbor. I worked third shift, so my days began after sleeping in the mornings. On August 7th, a day I'll never forget, I got off work, took a short nap, and headed out to run errands. As I reached my car, my neighbor Tyler stopped me and asked what I was doing outside the night before. He said he'd seen someone messing with my window screen. I assured him I'd been at work and shrugged it off as some drunk wandering around. That evening, I came home, put away groceries, and settled in to watch TV. By bedtime, I'd forgotten all about Tyler's comment. Around midnight, as I walked up the stairs to my bedroom, I heard a loud bang from the living room. I froze, listening. Seconds later, the sound of my window shattering echoed through the house. I'm a big guy, 6'4" and 280 pounds, and I thought my size would scare off any intruder. But when I ran downstairs, I found a man halfway through my broken window. He dropped to the floor, and we locked eyes. "Get the hell out of my house," I shouted, but he didn't budge. He just smiled, this chilling, paralyzing grin. And that's when I noticed the knife in his hand. "You take one step toward me, and I'll kill you," I warned, but his reply sent shivers down my spine. If you'd been at work tonight, this wouldn't have happened. I bolted up the stairs to my bedroom, slammed the door, and grabbed my Smith & Wesson .45 from the nightstand. Dialing 911, I relayed the situation to the dispatcher, who calmly told me, "If your door opens before officers arrive, you're within your rights to protect yourself." I waited in silence, gun in hand, listening for any movement. When I heard the police arrive, I threw my keys out the window so they could enter. Moments later, I heard them shout, "Drop the knife, get on the ground." When they called me down, I found out the man had been sitting on my couch, calm as could be when the officers arrived. To this day, I don't know why he was there or what he planned to do. I moved 40 miles away after that and haven't had any trouble since. But every time I think about that smile, I get chills. Mom's ghost story. My mom used to work as a janitor in an office building and often worked the morning shift. One night, she agreed to cover for a coworker and take the late shift. Her coworkers had warned her about the 8th floor, claiming it was haunted. According to them, a ghostly woman cried horribly around midnight. My mom didn't think much of it. She assumed they were trying to scare her since she was new. That night, she started cleaning from the top floor, setting the timer for the lights to stay on for an hour per floor. By the time she got to the 8th floor, she was nearly done for the night. While cleaning one of the offices, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the hallway. She froze, heart pounding. The sound of a woman's anguished cries followed, growing louder as the lights began to click off one by one. Panicked, she dropped her supplies and bolted for the elevator. By the time she reached it, she was surrounded by darkness, save for the glow of the elevator's button. She made it out safely, but quit the very next day. The lady in white shorts. I've worked as a toll booth cashier at an airport in Northwest Florida for 20 years, primarily on the graveyard shift. Over the years, I've gotten used to the quiet eeriness that comes with working nights. The dim lighting, the occasional distant sound of a plane taking off, the emptiness of the parking garage. It's all part of the job. But there's one place that always makes me uneasy: the 4th level of the parking garage. The garage is usually deserted at night, save for the occasional traveler hurrying to their car, or an employee cutting through on their way to another shift. The 4th level, though, has always felt off. It's hard to explain. The air feels heavier there, and the shadows seem deeper, even with the overhead fluorescent lights. I've never liked being up there, especially alone. One night, I was assigned to inventory license plates on the 4th level. It was a cold night for Florida. I parked the golf cart near the center of the level and began walking up and down the rows, entering plate numbers into my handheld device. The first half hour passed uneventfully. The cold made my breath visible, and my footsteps echoed faintly in the empty structure. I was focused on my work, eager to finish quickly and head back to the heated toll booth. As I rounded the corner of one row, I looked up and froze. Near the edge of the garage, a woman stood perfectly still. She wore a baby blue short-sleeved shirt and white shorts, an outfit completely unsuited for the weather. Her shoulder-length black hair framed her pale face, but I couldn't make out her expression. Something about her presence immediately unsettled me. Why was she out here, dressed like that, in the freezing cold? And how had I not heard her approach? I glanced down for a second to log the last plate I'd scanned. When I looked back up, she was gone. The uneasy feeling in my chest tightened. I stood there for a moment, scanning the area, trying to figure out where she could have gone. There was no sound of footsteps retreating. The sliding glass doors to the elevator lobby, which always made a distinct squeaking noise, hadn't moved. It was as if she'd vanished into thin air. I finished my task quickly, constantly glancing over my shoulder. Every sound, the wind howling through the garage, the faint hum of the lights, felt amplified. When I got back to the booth, I told my coworkers about the woman. They laughed it off, saying I was just tired or imagining things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that what I'd seen was real. Over the next few weeks, I started asking other employees about the 4th level. One of the maintenance workers mentioned hearing footsteps up there late at night, only to find the level completely empty. A cleaning crew member once thought they saw someone dart between cars, but when they investigated, no one was there. It wasn't until months later that I learned the full story. An older employee, someone who'd been working at the airport long before I started, pulled me aside after overhearing me mention the woman in white shorts. He lowered his voice and said, "You're not the first to see her." He explained that years ago, before the airport had upgraded its parking facilities, there'd been an incident on the 4th level. A young woman, possibly a traveler or someone dropping off a loved one, had been found near the edge of the garage. Some said she'd jumped, but others believed something more sinister had happened. Her case was never solved, and over time, her story faded into airport lore, something people whispered about but rarely acknowledged. Hearing this chilled me to the bone. Was the woman I'd seen that night her? And if so, why had she appeared to me? Now, every time I'm assigned to the 4th level, I can't help but feel on edge. I check my surroundings twice as carefully, half expecting to see her standing there again, silently watching. It's been years since that night, but I still think about her. Was she trying to tell me something? Or was she just there, a lingering echo of a tragedy long past? I don't know, but one thing's for sure. I'll never look at the 4th level the same way again. The clown in the elevator. I recently moved to a big city to attend college, sharing an apartment with my mom and 2-year-old son. A week ago, something happened that made me question how safe this building really is. After working a graveyard shift, a coworker dropped me off at my apartment around 4 a.m. The entrance doors, normally locked after 10 p.m., were strangely unlocked. As I got into the elevator, someone stepped in behind me. I looked up and froze. It was a man in a full clown outfit, blue with white stripes, oversized shoes, a red nose, and garish makeup. He carried a bag and stared at me with a blank expression that quickly twisted into a sinister grin. As the elevator ascended, he bent down to open his bag. The doors opened on my floor, and I bolted, shouting, "Have a nice morning!" Before I could make it to my door, I heard him laughing, a bone-chilling cackle. He pulled out a massive kitchen knife and started chasing me. I barely made it inside, slamming the door shut just as he reached me. I called 911, shaking. By the time the police arrived, the clown was gone. They didn't doubt my story. A man matching my description had been seen nearby, and there'd been a murder in the area just days before. The thought of that clown still haunts me. The museum, at night. This isn't strictly a story from my night shift, but it involves someone I interacted with, an employee at the company responsible for monitoring the nighttime security systems of the place where I used to work. I used to be the executive director of a large science museum on the eastern seaboard. At one point, we hosted a human cadaver exhibit, much like the Bodyworks display over in Houston, Texas. If you're not familiar with these kinds of exhibits, they involve people who choose to donate their bodies after death, not just to medical science, but to museums and similar institutions for public education. The skeletons you sometimes see in biology classrooms used to be real, though most are now replaced by plastic models. But occasionally, real remains are still used, thanks to selfless individuals who offer their bodies to further education. Morbid? Sure, but also incredibly fascinating, and surprisingly popular. Our cadaver exhibit drew enormous crowds and generated a significant amount of revenue for the museum. It was memorable for that reason, but also for something that still sends chills down my spine. One night, during the middle of the exhibit's run, I got a call from the security company monitoring the museum after hours. It was just past 1:30 a.m., and as part of my role overseeing the museum security, I was the one who had to take the call. I remember groaning as I rolled out of bed, bleary-eyed when I saw the company name flash on my phone screen. 9 times out of 10, these calls were nothing but false alarms, usually an oversensitive door sensor. I'd log into the security cameras remotely, verify everything was fine with the security staff on the other end, and go back to bed. Annoying, but a necessary evil. That night, however, was different. The security guy on the phone informed me that the motion detectors had picked up movement inside the building. That jolted me awake. While the cameras could sometimes glitch, the motion sensors never had before. Not once in all my years working there. As I booted up the security camera feed, I asked where the sensors were going off. His response froze me. The human cadaver exhibit. I asked, half joking, what could anyone possibly want with a bunch of preserved corpses? The guard's reply came in a shaky voice. You should check for yourself. When the camera feed loaded, the exhibit appeared exactly as it should, quiet and undisturbed. The preserved bodies stood, sat, or knelt in their display cases, utterly still. There wasn't a single living soul in sight. Trying to stay calm, I asked the guard if he was certain the motion detectors had been triggered. Could it have been a malfunction? No, he replied firmly, though his voice trembled. If the system fails, the sensors stop working altogether. They don't give false readings. We watched the feeds together for 10, maybe 15 minutes. Everything remained silent and motionless. Then, suddenly, the guard's voice broke in again. They just went off again. Where? I asked. All of them, he whispered. That was it. I had no choice but to drive down to the museum in the dead of night to check it out in person. Walking through that dark, empty building, knowing what exhibit I was heading toward, was unnerving, to say the least. When I reached the cadaver exhibit, everything appeared exactly as it should. The bodies were still in their display cases, perfectly unmoving, but I can't even begin to describe the overwhelming sense of unease that gripped me as I walked through the room. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. There were no intruders. Nothing was out of place. But that night remains the single creepiest experience of my career. Even now, I can't explain what caused the motion detectors to trigger repeatedly. Was it some rare technical glitch, or something else entirely? I have no idea. What I do know is that I sincerely hope I never have to experience anything like that again. The stalker. When I was a teenager, I worked part-time at a crappy home improvement retail store. My shifts usually started after college classes, running from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m., but sometimes I had to stay until closing at 10 p.m. Those late-night shifts were a mixed bag. Half the time, the place felt eerily empty, and the other half was spent dealing with oddball customers or last-minute rushes. On one of those late evenings, I was tidying up my department at the back of the store when a red-haired cashier came over. She was holding a cart full of random items that customers had decided not to buy. She asked, straight up, if I could walk around with her while she restocked the shelves. Now, I'm not the bravest guy, but I've always had a bit of a white knight complex. Without even thinking, I agreed. As we started walking, I asked her why she wanted me to tag along. She told me this older guy, mid to late 40s, had been following her around all day. Apparently, he'd come in multiple times during her 9 or 10-hour shift, each time flirting with her and making her uncomfortable. She'd reported him to our security team, but let me tell you, our 2 security guards were about as useful as a pair of wet socks. Despite her complaints, they couldn't even track the guy down, even though he'd been back half a dozen times. So here we were, wandering through the aisles of a nearly empty store while she put stuff back. As we talked, I kept an eye out for anyone suspicious. Then I saw him. He was half hidden between an end cap and the lumber storage, watching us. He fit her description, older, but ripped as hell, like he spent every waking moment bench pressing. He was taller than me, maybe 6'2" or 6'3" to my 5'11". His eyes locked onto mine, and the look he gave me, it's hard to describe. It was like I'd stolen something precious from him. Wild, furious, and trembling with barely contained rage. For a split second, I froze. This dude looked like he could snap me in half without breaking a sweat. The store was close to closing, and the skeleton crew was scattered all over the place. If he decided to charge at me, there wouldn't have been anyone nearby to help. Somehow, I mustered the courage to ask, "Can I help you, sir? We're just about closing here." I tried to sound firm and confident, but my heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst. The guy hesitated, glaring at me like he was weighing his options. Then, without saying a word, he turned and walked off. The redhead looked at me with a nervous smile. "That was him, wasn't it?" she whispered. "Yeah," I replied, feeling a mix of relief and unease. We finished her restocking as quickly as possible. By the time my shift ended, the parking lot was mostly empty. Almost every car left belonged to employees, except for one vehicle parked way off on the other side of the lot. I couldn't see if anyone was inside, but there shouldn't have been any customers still hanging around at that hour. The next day, the redhead told me the guy had followed her after work. She'd managed to shake him by taking a sudden turn onto a side road at the last second. That was the last straw for her. She quit shortly after that, and honestly, I couldn't blame her. I never saw her or the guy again. I don't even remember her name. It's been too long, but I've thought about that night more times than I can count. We lived in a small city where this kind of thing didn't happen often. The guy must have been from out of town. The crazy redhead. I work at a cafe in downtown, smack in the middle of an area with a handful of homeless shelters and a well-known drug problem. It's not unusual to deal with odd characters, and over the years, I've gotten used to handling strange situations. One afternoon, I was working behind the bar when this redheaded kid, probably in his early 20s, wandered in and sat down in the seating area. At first, he seemed like he was just hanging out, but then he started muttering something under his breath. A minute or two passed, and his behavior got weirder. He started moving his hands in odd patterns, like he was casting some kind of spell. I kept an eye on him, hoping he'd settle down, but no such luck. Suddenly, he got up and began yelling, disturbing the other customers. I walked over trying to stay calm and professional, and told him he needed to leave for the day. He turned to me, his eyes wide and intense, and said, "This is all a giant game. I'll fucking kill you with one finger." Now, I'm no stranger to death threats. Working downtown, you hear stuff like that often enough that it barely registers anymore. I waved him off, told him to leave, and he finally stormed out. I thought that was the end of it. Fast forward to closing time, around 9 p.m. It wasn't technically a night shift, but in the middle of winter, it might as well have been. It was pitch black outside. After locking up the cafe, I started the 6-block walk to the parking garage, where my car was parked. It's a routine I've done hundreds of times, but downtown at night in the winter? It's eerie. The streets were mostly empty, and the dark made everything feel a little more sinister. About 2 blocks into my walk, I heard a faint hissing noise. I stopped in my tracks, looking around, but the street was deserted. A chill ran down my spine, not from the cold, but from the way the sound seemed to come from nowhere. I started walking again, this time picking up the pace. That's when I heard it. Hurried footsteps in the snow behind me. My heart shot into my throat. I didn't dare look back. I just kept walking faster, my boots crunching against the icy ground. The footsteps quickened to match my pace. "Fuck this," I muttered under my breath, and broke into a sprint. When I reached the parking garage, I yanked open the door and slammed it behind me, my breath clouding in the freezing air. I wasn't going to risk waiting for the elevator, so I took the stairs, bounding up 2 at a time. As I reached the first landing, I heard the door I'd just come through slam shut. The sound echoed through the stairwell, and my pulse raced as I bolted up the remaining flights. I finally reached my car, fumbling with the keys in my shaking hands. As soon as I got the door open, I jumped inside and locked it. I thought I was safe, but then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. It was the redhead from earlier. Only this time, he wasn't muttering spells or making vague threats. He was furious. His face was twisted in rage, and he was sprinting full speed toward my car. Before I could react, he started pounding on my windows, screaming at the top of his lungs, "I'm going to fucking kill you." His fists hit the glass with such force I thought they might shatter. Adrenaline kicked in, and I did the only thing I could think of. I put the car in reverse, then slammed the door into him as I peeled out of the parking spot. He stumbled back, giving me just enough time to hit the gas and speed out of the garage. When I got home, I couldn't stop shaking. I locked every door and window and didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I called the cops and reported the incident. To my surprise, they found the guy later that day. Apparently, he fully corroborated my story, telling them he thought he was part of the Illuminati and had been targeting me as part of some game. He ended up serving a short stint in jail and got slapped with a restraining order. I haven't seen him since, thank God.